Now, the Chinese Communist Party will hold its 1 in 5 years Congress this weekend, in which President Xi Jinping is largely expected to be re-elected for a new term. It's the top story in some of the French papers this morning, and Deeptika Laurent is here to tell us more about it.
That's right, Alison. That the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party opens in Beijing this Sunday, and it'll run for about a week, at the end of which Xi Jinping is expected to be reaffirmed for a third term as leader of the Chinese Communist Party. It's something that, if it does happen, it's something that would not have been seen since the era of Mao Zedong. And this Congress uniting more than 2,000 delegates. Now, for the French paper Les Echos, that's a French business paper, it is taking place under a sort of new era, one that's also punctuated, at the moment at least, by a very turbulent period in China. The economic model is that was based on investment is floundering, Les Echos says, and the country is still reeling from how it handled COVID. And you see it's on the front page there. But Les Echos does go with a headline saying that President Xi Jinping is the emperor of a China that's sort of running out of breath, if you like. It's also on the front page of L'Opinion, the French right-wing paper today. You see it here. The real strategy of Xi Jinping, L'Opinion says, and it is focusing more on the impact of the war in Ukraine on Xi Jinping's term. Also, because he will be seeking to ensure that he doesn't follow down the road of his counterpart, Vladimir Putin, and you see that here on the front page of L'Opinion, which is looking at the key topics of this party congress that takes place this weekend. For Mr. T, a French cartoonist, the bar, though, is being set pretty low for this Congress party meeting. You see here Xi Jinping saying, "My achievement is that I have not invaded Taiwan, at least yet." So you sort of get an idea of the sort of cynicism surrounding this Congress meeting, Alison.
And what about the Chinese papers, Deepti? What do they have to say?
Well, it's a completely different story for the Chinese papers. The Global Times, as you can imagine, that's a newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, they're really focusing on the positive side of everything, looking at how this Chinese Communist Party has pulled the country out of poverty and achieved moderate prosperity, it says, by 2021. That was one of its centenary goals. Now, going forward, the party is looking at its second centenary goal, which is building a modern, democratic, socialist country, one that's thriving and prosperous. The China Daily, meanwhile, on its front page, hails the fact that the Communist Party actually consulted with members from outside the party for its draft report that it'll be presenting at this Congress. So sort of small details that the paper's focusing on to call this an important way of practicing socialist consulting democracy. But democracy is certainly a term that one cartoonist is sniggering at today. This is from an Italian cartoonist. You see that Congress meeting pretty much attended by President Xi Jinping, and President Xi Jinping.
Yeah, not a lot of dissent probably from that crowd. Moving on, Deepti, to the strikes on oil refineries here in France. There's been a breakthrough in talks.
That's right, and it is the focus of the French left-wing papers today. Let's look at L'Humanité, that's a French communist paper. They're actually leading with comments from this man. He's Philippe Martinez. He's consider him the top union leader here in France, and in particular, the paper is focusing on his calls that this strike that began in French oil refineries should be generalized to other sectors like transport and industry. Libération, as always, the left-leaning paper Libération, always going with a very inspired headline, one that's focusing on wordplay today in French, but essentially the essence of the front page is the same as L'Humanité, which is the idea that these strikes should be generalized across the country, and that the demands for higher salaries in France are getting louder and louder and are very prevalent, not just in this industry, but across several industries right now.
The international papers, though, are focusing on Emmanuel Macron's controversial requisitioning of some of those workers.
Well, a lot of criticism against Emmanuel Macron today. This is from Anne-Elisabeth Moutet in the British Daily Telegraph. She says the French president has lit a political fire, really, with those calls, with that sort of ultimatum issued to some of the striking workers by the French government that they return to work, which was really seen as an infringement on the right to protest. Well, for this writer here in the Daily Telegraph, Emmanuel Macron has lit a political fire, and she says once again he has misread the French, because even if these strikes are crippling the daily lives of French people, they do very much remain sympathetic to the protests, to the demands of strikers. And this is from a website called Unheard. It's an independent website. And what's interesting is a headline here. You see here, Emmanuel Macron moves to crush the protesters again. And it's really sort of a headline that you would see when we're talking about an authoritarian country, not a democratic one like France. But you certainly get an idea of how the international press see Emmanuel Macron and his government right now.
Heading to the world of fashion next, Deep D. British Vogue's cover for its November issue is pretty unprecedented. It pays homage to the late Queen Elizabeth.
That's right. A very sober cover, Alison. Look at this. It's a Vogue cover with a royal purple blue background. It says Her Majesty the Queen, and the editor of British Vogue, Edward Enninfold, writes today that the magazine's choice of cover was really to pay homage to Queen Elizabeth, because her death felt like the farewell to a Britain of the past, and that he personally responded to her steadiness, to her joy-filled fashion choices, her kind but no-nonsense manners. Well, what is interesting is this cover is very much in keeping with Vogue's covers in the past when monarchs passed away. This cover here was when King George V died in 1936. And you see a similar cover in 1952 when Queen Elizabeth's father, King George VI, passed away in 1952.
All right, keeping with tradition. Finally from you, Deepti, I think we have a moment to perhaps take a look at least one picture from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year Awards. The winners have been announced.
That's right. It's a chance to gawk at some really beautiful pictures that also raise awareness about the loss of animal habitats in particular. This is the grand winner, a photo by the American photographer Karine Egner, with a stunning image of a ball of cactus bees vying for a mate. But if I've got just a few seconds to show you some of the other ones, this one's quite startling. Polar bears moving closer and closer to human habitats as their search for food becomes harder and harder. You also have this one, which was taken by a teenage photographer in Thailand. And finally, this one is one of my personal favorites. It's a primate who was left orphaned by charcoal gangs in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Alison.
Oh, I do always love seeing those photos. Deepti, thank you so much for that look through today's papers. That's it for this edition. Stay with us on France 24. More news coming up.